Hello, and welcome to the Fresh Air Sci-Fi Show. I'm Joe.
And I'm Dave.
And, hello! Yeah, I have to apologise again for a bit of sloppy mixing there. Isn't it always sloppy? But it was possibly more so than usual. I was mixing tunes that I've never mixed before, mixed with tunes that I haven't mixed for about 3 years. So...
Yeah, that makes it kind of hard to guess the rhythm that's coming in.
Yeah. Some of them is that they drop in. I'm like, oh, it's this one. I remember now.
Oops.
Yeah. Plus, I was trying to get the hang of the beat jump feature as well, which is something that's really useful, but not something I actually use much myself. It's one thing I do is make use of the loop feature on the turntables, especially if I've accidentally got the thing, going in too early or something like that. I'll loop it round on a certain section so the other one can catch up. The beat jump is sort of like the opposite way of attacking the problem. It's like, crap, I've started this track too late. You can jump forwards 4, 8, 16, 32 bars at a time. Actually, on different software and kit, you can jump ahead even further than that. But I still just can't quite get the use of it. I just fuck it up every single time I try. But if I don't keep trying, I'm never going to get better at it. So I may as well keep on trying.
That's it. It's all practice,
isn't it? And at the end of the day, the important part of the streams isn't me having a mix. That's just me doing something a little bit before we actually start. So. I don't expect many people to check out the mixes. I mean, I don't know how many people that like philosophy also like drum and bass and glitch hop and breakbeat and stuff like that. Well, apart from you, Dave, yeah. Oh no, Dave, you've frozen. Is it my end or yours? Oh, you're back.
Yeah, I think it might be your end.
Oh, really?
Because it's been running fine for ages.
It has been running
now
fine
you're
for ages.
behind.
I'm behind.
You're out of sync.
Oh dear. Well, I'm not getting any underruns, but I will close the DJ software because that's no longer needed. And maybe it's a hardware issue rather than a network issue. Shouldn't be a network issue. Although, actually, the extra webcam that is my phone, is actually on is going through the Wi-Fi as well. Cool little app actually, Droid Cam. So you can basically broadcast over Wi-Fi or plugged in through USB from your phone as an additional webcam. So the reason I had the extra camera there today was so one of the people that watches us basically thought that the camera setup for when I'm DJing's all right, but you only see my back, and he'd rather see my face whilst I'm mixing. I don't know why, because I pull all sorts of funny faces whilst I'm having a mix. You can tell the difference. When I'm really in the zone, it's all sort of grinding, gurney sort of faces, and when I feel like I'm stacking it up and I'm trying to like get it back, I go really pensive, like. So yeah, I imagine if anyone was to watch that bit, they'd have seen a lot of and not as much.
You're about to be put on a bunch of deep fake porn.
Wicked. So yes, hello and welcome to the show. Tonight we are discussing the horror of it all. Now, Dave and I quite like the horror genre ourselves, and it is one of those things where I think horror, you've got sort of 3 categories of horror. You've got good horror that's really good and actually scary in some way, shape or form. And you've got horror that's so terrible it's entertaining and funny, and then you've got the run-of-the-mill shit in the middle that is basically weak story, everybody making a load of fuck-ups, very unimaginative, and it's more quiet, jump, quiet, expecting a jump, no jump, oh, there's the jump, and that's I mean, and that is the bulk of the genre, unfortunately. And, as much as I can say I love the genre, it's the stuff either end of that big load of wank in the middle that I like. But of course, we're not exactly discussing horror movies tonight. We're actually discussing the rationality of emotion in relation to fiction. So we are going to obviously start with horror examples, but we can spread out into other forms of other mediums as well. So it's not necessarily just going to be focused on horror, but it's where we'll start. So, Dave, do you want to take away what we're going to have a full-on discussion about?
I missed pretty much all of what you just said then because it froze.
Oh, is it freezing your end? Oh dear. This isn't good, is it?
No.
I even made sure I restarted the computer and everything before the show, just in case, because I have been having a couple of dodgy moments. So I was just explaining what we're doing tonight. We're covering off the rationality of emotion in relation to fiction. And we will spread into other genres, but sort of we'll focus on horror to start with because you can have quick and easy examples with that, and maybe then go into other stories.
Yeah, horror is one of the easiest to point to because of the type of emotional response that it is. It's fear. It's quite a common one. And we understand what we should be afraid of.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's harder to say what we should be upset about than it is to say what we should fear.
Yeah. I suppose that naturally we fear anything that will cause us harm, suffering, death. In general, obviously, there's phobias which are considered irrational fears in general. But yeah, so in general, you're thinking about something that's going to cause you harm or extreme suffering or even death when you're thinking about fear.
Yeah. And if you think about it, well, when somebody imagines losing their parents, they get upset.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, most people do. I imagine there's some
yeah,
people out there that
yeah,
don't.
yeah. But most people will feel that little bit upset and wonder what life will be like. And we wouldn't commonly say that there was something irrational about that.
Mm-hmm.
Because we all do it, and it's they are going to die at some points. Your life's going to change, so you start planning for it.
Mm-hmm.
But if we say if somebody's afraid of something that isn't there, we would generally call them irrational, wouldn't we?
Yes, we would. I suppose you could do I think there's a monster under my bed. And you look under the bed, there's no monster. I still think there's a monster under my bed, and I'm scared of the monster under my bed. I mean, obviously, that's more of generally children who would be scared of that. But you have a lot of adults that are afraid to go downstairs in their house at night in case there's a burglar down there. Now, well, did you hear anything? No, but there could be something there.
Yeah.
Right? And there you'd think you're being a bit irrational. You can understand the apprehension, but yeah.
Yeah, to be afraid of something that isn't real is generally considered irrational. But if we think about it, that's exactly what we're doing when we watch a film.
Yep.
So the question is, is it rational to be afraid of a horror film? Because if it's not rational to fear something that doesn't exist, then you're kind of fearing something that doesn't exist when you get scared by whatever psycho stalker is on the screen, or the scenario of somebody about to get harmed in, say, a ghost film. I mean, none of it's real, so...
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I think being made to jump is natural in that sense, because even though you know it's coming, that sudden noise, it's almost a built-in reaction to us. But when you're talking about the actual fear, I mean, this is something when we talk about when we did theatre studies and media studies and all those things is the suspense of disbelief. And a really good play, for example, is one that will get you completely wrapped up in it and sort of make you almost believe it, that you're there, that you're experiencing the story. I mean, you can even get it when you're in a book and you're reading it so well, it feels like the reality you're in, and you're the protagonist or antagonist in the book that you're reading. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily rational, but that is what we do with it. So I think that there is a certain element to it that it could be said was natural. I'm not necessarily sure I'd say it was rational, though.
That's the thing, isn't it? It becomes a slightly more difficult question to answer when you start actually thinking about all the things that go into it.
Mm.
And this sort of topic, if you think about it, is it you get these people who get upset when they read like a compelling drama novel. Their heroine dies. They get upset, genuinely get upset. So again, is that rational? So this paradox covers more than just horror. But like I say, the horror is just the easiest one to sort of spot the irrationality with, I think. Because if you think about being upset by your favorite heroine dying, you're imagining a scenario that doesn't exist at the moment. Or you're imagining a scenario that doesn't exist, just as with imagining your parents are going to die. You get upset by that, but that's imaginary.
Mm. Yeah, I suppose with your parents dying, it is something that's going to happen. So there is all that thought of, when this happens, I don't know how I'm going to cope with it. So I'd say that's more rational, because even though it's imaginary at the moment, it's an imagination of something that is real. I think the thing when you come into, for example, the heroine dying, you've got attached to that character, and you might have seen that character as someone in your life, or even as yourself, or something like that. So again, I'd go, it's definitely natural for us to put ourselves into these stories and to have the emotions, but it comes back to the question, is that rational? Is what is natural to us rational? I'd say not always. Some things are, some things aren't. Context matters. So
Yeah.
is there an example, though? Say, for example, you're watching something and you identify with the characters and you do see them as your parents. Now, whether your parents are dead or alive, I don't think necessarily matters, but you really feel that these people on screen are your parents, and you watch them die horrifically, and it brings up sort of all the memories of your parents, or your imagination of your parents dying, and you get really upset about it because of that attachment, that link there. Versus, say, in a horror where there's some evil penis demon from outer space causing havoc on everything, it's completely unreal. So the fear there, if you were getting scared by it, would you say that that's more irrational than the other one, or would you say they're equally irrational?
That's a good question. I think it's a little more complicated than that. But I think one triggering the memories of the parent is probably slightly more rational than being afraid of the evil demon in the cabin in the woods.
Mm.
Because, like you said, there's an actual real event that's sort of aligns to in the future will actually obtain in reality. But the whole demons thing, like one of my favorite films is The Omen.
Mm-hmm.
And now I don't believe in God. I don't believe in any of the thing. but I still find it to be a brilliant film, and all that stuff interwoven into it is great. And it's just a damn good horror film.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it really kind of matters. Context kind of matters, but with a horror film, they can scare you and give you an emotional response without triggering one of those "this will obtain in reality" memories.
Yeah, unless I suppose when you're younger, your imagination runs even further wild with you, so you might actually believe these are real things that you're seeing, because you don't know any better. So that goes back to the rationality debate of someone can only be as rational as they can be. So children are, on an adult level, incredibly irrational, but they are as rational as they can be. So it's like when we were discussing beliefs, we're saying, if a child believes something because his dad says so, then, that's perfectly rational. But if a 20-year-old does it for his dad, especially if it's something that he's not an expert in, just because my dad said so, that wouldn't be rational. So you could say a child being convinced by a horror movie that these things are real and they're going to get him, and this is just a tale of some news event in another town and they're going to be on the way to him soon, and oh my god, that might actually be more rational than an adult feeling that way about what's going on. So if we can say that a realistic situation which causes some form of memory type event within you that you really attach to the characters, obviously it's still fiction, they're still not those people, but your emotional attachment is actually to someone else and they just remind you of them. So we could say that emotion, whilst not wholly rational, is definitely more rational than something completely unrealistic like a penis demon in a horror. But if it was a more realistic horror / thriller, more suspense driven, perhaps going almost into to more of a crime thriller than, say, a typical horror, with someone that's a bit of a sociopath or something like that, going around killing people because they can, or because they're harvesting organs, whatever it is. There you can think, shit, that could actually happen. I remember a film that I saw when I was a kid, and I think they've actually released a mini-series of this film now, and it was called, I can't remember what it was called actually, but the mini-series that they've released that I started watching the first episode of, it's called Coma. But this basically, it was in a doctor's surgery, and there was one operating theatre that when people went into, they didn't come out of, or at least they did, but they came out in a coma. And what was happening was, during the procedure, for 8 seconds or something like that, the oxygen was basically turned off and they were pumped full of carbon dioxide, and then it turned back on, went there, and they ended up having essentially a brain death. And through this movie, the protagonist is trying to uncover all of this sort of stuff, and then they do something to her and go, oh, she needs surgery, because they've worked out that she's worked it out, so on and so forth. And she's going into room 8, which is the bad room as well. And yeah, so luckily at the end of the movie, someone got up there and cut the line so it wouldn't happen to her, and all sorted. But that got me thinking for ages. I was scared of going to the hospital because, well, what if they do that to me? I didn't ever want to be put under, because this was a realistic thing that could happen. There could be this sort of thing going on in a hospital. Obviously, I sound like a balmy conspiracy theorist saying that as an adult, but it really, really, really worried me with a child and stuck with me. And when I saw this pop up and started watching it, I got all those feelings I got as a kid again. I was like, I can't watch this late at night, even though it wasn't a proper scary horror. It's just, essentially people, putting people in a coma and harvesting their organs.
Yeah.
But when it's a more realistic thing, again, you can attach some, well, you've got reality with it. So whilst it's fiction, there's a genuine possibility of that fiction being true. And I think when there's that possibility of truth, it's probably more rational than something that is, well, obviously untrue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's it's like a good point bringing that stuff up, because one of the ways you could argue irrationality and rationality, again, just to fine tune it that little bit more, is if we consider rational responses to certain types of films. Like if you watched a horror and it was the most gruesome, almost realistic snuff-like film you've ever seen, and you found it funny, even though you found it convincingly realistic, that's probably not a rational response. Whereas a horror film is designed to scare you. Like you say, the jump scares, they're designed to be loud noises, make you go, what the fuck was that? A good psychological horror does what that thriller does, where it draws you in and makes you think, well, what if this could be real? So there are certain rational responses to types of films, but whether those responses are rational in themselves as well, it makes such an interesting kind of puzzle there.
Yeah, because obviously it's fiction, and let's go with the grotesque one again. It's gruesome, you should be disgusted by it. But obviously it's not real. So being disgusted by it is irrational in itself, but it looks real. So it's probably more rational than you say as if you suddenly found it funny and laughed at
Yep.
it. Though that says a lot about me. I don't know if you've watched them. They were terrible, but I liked them. The Final Destination films.
Yeah, I loved them.
The second one, I was watching it with my mate Howard, and every single death we laughed at because they were just so unrealistically funny. Just like all of a sudden, this thing happening. It was just like fucking hell.
It was black comedy.
Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. So obviously, our entertainment, our art of any form, but in this medium, we're talking about video, cinema. It's designed to make us feel something. So feeling something other than intended is definitely more irrational, but because it's fiction, it's irrational in itself to have those feelings. But if you didn't have those emotional feelings towards it, you also wouldn't enjoy it.
You wouldn't be engaging with it.
No. So so even though it's irrational, it's still the most rational thing to feel these emotions, the right emotions towards it, than the wrong ones or no emotions. So
it all gets very complicated.
Yeah, but basically it's just different layers of irrationality then, isn't it? There is no real rationality with it. No matter what you do, you're wrong.
Yeah, it just depends on how you frame it as to whether you can find a piece of rationality there. But at its core, it's still irrational.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things I love. Like most people skim over aesthetics, but I find it kind of fascinating because you have questions like this. And the interesting thing about questions like this is you might hear the question and think, well, it doesn't really say very much. Who cares? But it's kind of an interesting question just thinking about the rationality part itself. But it also involves a paradox, psychology, how emotions work, actual engaging with fictional material as you should. It's not just a simple question. It's got a whole load of areas mixed up with it.
Yeah. I mean, you think it's going to be easy as well. I mean, I think a standard response would be If you've suspended your disbelief and you've got absorbed into the story, then it's perfectly rational to feel what they feel. I think that would be, if you're taking it from the surface and not actually looking deep into the topic. But I think it was like you said the other day, though, Dave. I say the other day when we were having a conversation about aesthetics, was the fact that, is your disbelief really suspended?
Yeah.
Because unless you actually fully believe you're there, you're not. You haven't fully suspended your disbelief of it. So there's some of that there, because obviously you're absorbed in it and you're, oh yeah, I'm in the story, but you still are aware that you're you and not actually in the story. So you're not fully there, but your mind is, and emotions are fully engaged with it. And I think that's what people mean by suspense of disbelief. It's talking about a level of engagement and realism that can, really convinces someone that they are there, even though they know that they're not under it all. Before we continue, we've got a couple of comments from LB. So he knows a little bit about rationality of emotions. Emotions can be rational when they come at the right time and for the right reason. That is an interesting one. So I think as a default, emotions tend not necessarily to be rational. It's our response to the emotion that can be rational or not. So Dave could step on my toe. I could be angry about him doing that because he's hurt me. The pain caused that emotional response. Oh, why'd you do that? But I could go bang and punch him in the face, or I could go, "Hey, watch it, mate." Even though I've got the same emotion going on, it's my response to the emotion. I think emotions in themselves are probably irrational entities, if we could say that about them. Not necessarily irrational, but not necessarily rational either. So it goes, it's like this. If people have visions, is it irrational to disregard it if it came true? No, because it's someone going, I think this is going to happen. I think it's perfectly natural to say, oh, fuck off, you're being an idiot. I'll give you an example. I was a teenager out for a few drinks. We'd gone to the pub, got very drunk. We'd then gone back to a mate's house. It was my friend's birthday. I took him out for a night drinking. Both underage. We were naughty boys. And then we went back to a mate's house, had a bit of a smoke, and we were walking home and back to mine for the night. And we were walking across this park, and I suddenly went, "There's a car coming." And he went, "What?" I went, "There's a car coming." Completely dead. You couldn't hear anything anywhere. But no, there's definitely a car coming. He went, "Shut up, Joe." I was like, "No, there's a car coming. I know it's no. Look, you're just being paranoid." I was like, "Oh, whatever." Then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we hear a car, and he goes, "Oh, look, there's a car coming." I was like, "Yeah, it's a police car. They're going to pull over there, and there's going to be two cops that get out of it." And he went, "What? Shut up! You're just being paranoid." As we're crossing the road through a little roundabout and over, police car pulls out, two cops come out of it. Now, he was perfectly rational to disregard what I was saying, because he's right, I was being paranoid. Did I have a real vision? At the time, I felt like I did, because I was very, very inebriated. But at the end of the day, that was just paranoid. And he was perfectly rational by disregarding what I was saying. I had nothing to base it on other than I felt it was going to happen. So... no, it's not irrational to disregard it if it came true. However, if someone had the ability to, every single time someone flipped a card, know exactly what was coming up, no matter what it happened, no matter how many decks were in there, so on and so forth, they did it every single time, they got it right, and you were then to disregard them the next time they called a card, I'd say that was probably closer to being irrational, because at that point, you've got some evidence that they can do this sort of thing. So if it's someone who has visions, but say 1 in 10 of them are correct, but they go, look, I've had 50 correct ones. They're ignoring all the others, but they had 50 correct visions, and oh, you should believe me. Well, no, again, it's basically guesswork at that point, and if you make enough predictions, some of them are bound to come true. You know? Oh, and he was talking about Final Destination. He loved the first one. The first one's the darkest and most serious. No, I did find that with the Final Destination films. The first one was almost a serious movie, and then the second one, they made it ridiculous, which is why I was laughing the whole way through it. I can't even remember if I saw the rest of them or not. Those were hazy days. But yeah. Cool, I hope that's answered your thoughts there, though, LB.
Just going back to what LB says here. Emotions can be rational when they come at the right time and for the right reason. So this kind of brings us back to the paradox again. Is being afraid of something that isn't real the right reason to be afraid?
If the intention of that thing is to cause fear, even though it's not real, is that a good reason to be afraid? Back at you, Dave.
Well, no, that's a good question. But, again, it's not real. That it sort of highlights the thing. Like I said, this question sort of involves paradoxes, and what it's based on is something called the paradox of fictional emotion. And that question kind of highlights why it's a paradox. I'll just read it out to you. Okay, so a paradox is two or more statements that on their own seem true, but taken all together cannot be true.
One of the most common ones people might be aware of is the paradox of intolerance.
Yeah, because that's a collection of statements like tolerance is the best thing for a society. If we become too tolerant of intolerance, though, then we will become an intolerant society.
So tolerate everything except for intolerance.
Yeah. So it becomes a paradox.
Yeah.
So this one, statement one, is when ordinary rational people like us experience fictional representations, we feel emotions such as fear, sorrow, and joy. So that's a statement that's absolutely correct, because we've basically been discussing all the different ways that we do have emotional responses.
Mm-hmm.
In their rational forms, emotions such as fear, sorrow, and joy involve beliefs that they are about things that are real and non-fictional.
Which again, yeah.
Yeah, and just to expand on it a little bit more, if we were to hear a rustling in the bush and we thought, oh, I'm going to be robbed here, and we start imagining a few of the worst case scenarios, we wouldn't consider ourselves irrational as such, because these things do happen.
Yeah.
But if we got to the bush and a kitty cat jumped out, meowed, and ran off, we would then become irrational to still think it might be a mugger in the bush.
Yeah. Generally, in that situation, you'd find someone go, oh, it's just my mind playing tricks on me. Oh, silly me. And be relieved by it.
Yeah. And so when we watch a film, we're constantly reminded that it's not real, but we carry on letting it scare us or, make us sad and that kind of thing.
But that comes back to, as well, if we didn't let it happen, we wouldn't engage with it, we wouldn't enjoy the film, so therefore there'd be no point in watching the film.
Yeah, but again, this is strictly about the rationality of it all. So, yeah, generally, we would consider emotions to have intentional content that's based in reality, and or at least a possibility of reality. And when it's not got actual intentional content based in reality, that is, the beliefs are about something. And that something, if that something isn't real, we would generally start to think, well, that person's a bit crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, many atheists do it with God, if you think about it. I know a lot of just say lack of belief, but most people, when you get down to the nitty gritty, they believe the other person's God isn't real.
Mm-hmm.
And you hear a lot of it like you're delusional because your content isn't based, the belief isn't about anything that's real.
Mm-hmm.
It's a similar kind of thing.
Mm.
The atheist thinks that once the other person hears that God isn't real, or that, they believe God isn't real, they expect them to suddenly go, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, off on a tangent there, but it's the same. We consider the other person to be slightly irrational, or, other atheists consider the other person to be slightly irrational, because one thinks that the intentional content isn't real, so they think the other person is irrational for believing that something isn't real. Whenever we see people who have emotional content about something that isn't real, most rational people think that they're irrational.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, you can think of a number of different situations where you might see something like that as well. I mean, what, even if you go back to phobias, which we've already, I mean, they're irrational fears, but someone sees this tiny little spider that has no way of hurting them in any way, shape, or form, but someone's scared of them. Or you think about how people are scared of mice and things like that. Things where the thing can't actually hurt them in any way, shape, or form, but they have this fear reaction. You think that they are irrational, yet it comes back to the whole fiction thing, doesn't it, Dave? We know that this horror that we're watching isn't real, so why are we getting scared by it? We know that these people that have just died on screen that we identify with in some way aren't actually real, yet we're still upset by it, we're moved by it. So when you put it in quite black and white terms like that, you would say straight up that it's irrational.
Exactly. Which basically goes to proof statement 2.
Right there, Dave.
Getting a bit of a dry throat.
Oh no.
I got a cup of tea there. I'll have a swig in a sec.
Okay, cool.
So statement 3 in the paradox is, we do not have false or irrational beliefs about fictions. That is, we don't normally confusedly believe that the things that go on in fictions are real and non-fictional.
Hey, I'd just like to say hello to Essentially Leon joining us. Don't know if you've joined us before, but thank you for joining into the chat. Nice to see you here. Comment from you as well. Your rational mind is basically irrelevant when it comes to your subconscious involuntary responses. Usually those take the wheel. Yeah, so that sort of ties into what I was saying by emotions themselves are not necessarily rational or irrational. They're irrational. There's no reasoning in them. You can reason yourself into or out of an emotion potentially, but the emotion itself doesn't have that sort of processing going on. And as you say, your subconscious involuntary response, so that would be your emotion, and maybe even a reaction, like if you're hurt, going, that sort of thing, makes a lot of sense. But like I was saying earlier, if Dave was to step on my toe and it made me angry, I can't control that bit, but what I can do is control my behavior after I feel the emotion. Now, there are times emotions fully take over and you fly off the handle and you're not yourself. But with something like stepping on my toe, I can go, oh, step back. And at that point, I can choose whether I go in swimming, fuck you, Dave, and punch him in the face, or I go, oh, Dave, watch yourself, mate. You know, two very different reactions to the same emotion. But yeah. LB says, don't you dare get COVID on us, Dave. You'd have to leave the house to do that.
I don't even leave the house when we're not in lockdown.
Yeah. I actually went to the supermarket for the first time in a couple of months, and it felt like an outing the other day.
Yeah, it's getting kind of weird now, isn't it? It's been that long.
So you're curious at what all the buzz was about, so you decided it wouldn't hurt to check in. No, definitely not. Hopefully you enjoy our random musings. We do tend to go off piste quite a bit, so I do apologize in advance for that. But glad to have you here. Yeah, I mean, we tend to discuss generally a lot of philosophical stuff with a bit of science thrown in. And we've recently been discussing discussions quite a bit, and the different debate styles and how people can be heuristic or dialectic. And so today was a bit of a break from that. In fact, we were planning on finishing that segment on Tuesday, but we have part 2 of what we were doing on Tuesday, next Tuesday. But we've broken out of discussions and debate styles to have discussions around aesthetics. And tonight's on rationality of emotion.
The paradox of fictional emotion, basically.
So, Dave, just to remind us there, what were the points that you've put in there so far before you go on to the next one?
Okay. The first part of the paradox is when ordinary rational people like us experience fictional representations, we feel emotions such as fear, sorrow, and joy. And like we discussed, yep, in the opening of the discussion, we showed that all of that is true.
Mm-hmm.
The second part is, in their rational forms, emotions such as fear, sorrow, and joy involve beliefs that they are about things that are real and non-fictional.
Yeah. Yeah, like putting in a burglar alarm because you're afraid because you're in a slightly dodgy area. That's perfectly rational. You got the alarm, give you a bit of peace of mind. Put some extra locks on the doors, bit more peace of mind. Maybe not scared anymore, which would be a rational sort of fear. You're in a dodgy area. You're scared of what could happen.
Yeah, exactly. And the final part is, we do not have false or irrational beliefs about fiction. That is, we do not confuse and believe that the things that go on in fictions are real and non-fictional.
Yeah, I mean, that's going back to the suspense of disbelief point. People do suspend their disbelief, but not completely, because you're still aware that you're not actually in the play, the movie, the book, the TV show, that those people aren't really your parents, that, you know, the penis demon isn't real or whatever, you know. So as much as you can be very engaged with it and feel like you're there, there's still part of you that is grounded enough to know that you're not.
Yeah. I mean, if you suspended disbelief completely and you allowed yourself to think that everything that was going on was real, wouldn't you be an immoral person for not calling the cops on the rapist about to break in?
Yeah.
Or, you know, alert the NSA because you've just seen terrorists plotting to blow up a big part of America?
Yeah, if you truly suspended your disbelief. Yeah.
Well, those things would follow if you...
You watch Jurassic Park and you call someone, there's giant dinosaurs out here, man.
Yeah, that's it. If you allowed yourself to suspend belief that much, then you would be doing these kinds of things.
Yeah, as you said, you'd be irrational not to if you truly believe that these things were real. Yeah. But it's a good thing that people don't fully suspend their disbelief then, really. Otherwise, the FBI, NSA, etc. would be getting a hell of a lot of calls.
They'd have a lot of work on their hands chasing things that aren't real.
They've probably got a lot on their hands with that anyway, haven't they?
Yeah. So when it comes to a paradox, and like I say, these kinds of questions break out into other areas, and that's one of the things that makes them interesting. Surface level reading might just give you who cares? But a deeper reading can see all the different things that are involved in a simple question like that.
Yeah. So I think ultimately, if we're actually thinking about the emotional response into something, if it's completely real, then obviously we'd say that it's a rational emotion to have. But when you're talking about, say, a movie, let's go back to the grotesque one again. So if you were grossed out by it and like, because of how realistic it was, even though you know it's fiction, that is one sort of response. If you have the opposite response where you find it funny, I mean, that shows you're a bit twisted in yourself. Or you have, like, no emotional response. In the three categories there, the most rational is probably being grossed out by it, even though it is irrational. But it's been done in such a way that it is realistic and it does engage you. If you don't react to it, I'd say maybe it shows a lack of empathy, or maybe it just shows someone who is incredibly cognitive and not emotional at all. That doesn't necessarily mean they don't have empathy, but they're just their emotions are not as on the surface as the average person. And yeah, if you have the opposite response, a completely unexpected response to that sort of thing, I'd say that's probably the most irrational. Though realistically, having no emotional response should be the most rational thing because it's fiction. So I'm sort of going round and round in circles. And the opposite response is definitely really irrational. The desired response, the designed response, whilst not being completely rational, I would say is rational because that's what it's there for, and no emotion. I suppose it depends on the context of why there's no emotion, but probably shows a lack of empathy or someone who is overly cognitive. Or somewhere on the spectrum, I guess. Yeah, interesting. So either way, in regards to fiction, there isn't really a rational response.
Yep.
No matter what your response is, you're irrational, and that's being human, folks. We're all irrational.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that. It's one of those difficult things. Okay, and how you would answer it would probably depend on how you reject the paradox. When it comes to a paradox, we basically got 5 choices, depending on how many statements are in the actual paradox itself.
Mm-hmm.
So with the paradox of fictional emotions, we basically got 5 choices. We can accept that it's a paradox. Say, yep, no way around this. All those things are true, but they conflict with each other. There's no way to resolve it. We just got to accept it. You can just outright deny it's a paradox and not elucidate any further. It's not a very good answer to a paradox, but it's a possible response.
Mm-hmm.
And the other responses are we can reject one of the actual claims made in the paradox. So we can reject statement 1, 2, or 3.
Mm.
And how you respond to that paradox would probably define how you're attempting to say that they can be rational.
So, yeah. I don't know. As I said, emotions are not typically rational or irrational in themselves. It's your actions from it. So if you feel an emotion, but you then don't actually act on it because so like you were saying, terrorists attacking, well, if you truly suspended your disbelief, you would then go and phone someone saying, oh, someone's attacking the Nakatomi Plaza. But you don't do that because you are aware. So that comes back to what I was saying about your action past feeling the feeling. Like you stepping on my toe, I could overreact and take it as a personal insult and hit you for it or something like that. Or I could realize it was a mistake and just tell you to watch out. Just as watch out, Dave. So the same thing can be said for watching the fiction. It makes you feel something. It's supposed to make you feel something. We are emotional beings. But you then don't necessarily act on that emotion because you're aware it's not real.
That's where some rationality comes into it. And it goes back to the one where we said certain emotional responses are rational to what's happening on the screen. So that would be a rational emotional response to not go and call the cops. You might be putting yourself completely in the film and engaging in it and thinking, well, imagine if all this was real. But you're not allowing yourself to be grounded in that imagination. You're still responding to the imaginary scenario in the way that you should.
So, yeah, the action off of the back of it is what makes it as rational as it can be, even though it's not necessarily completely rational, being made to feel by something that is a fiction and something is a fiction as well. Yeah, interesting. So a couple of comments. Let me just skim through. So essentially Leon says they've watched a couple of clips and decided the way you like us thinking. I completely bastardized that word. You watched a couple of the clips uploaded and you liked the way we were thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. I apologize for fumbling so much there.
See, that's why people should watch us, because we need to practice speaking.
Yeah. Only been speaking for 36, 7. How old am I? Old enough to forget my age.
I'm old enough to be tired 5 minutes before I wake up.
So LB says, do you think emotions can play into our ethics with or without knowing? Okay, so they definitely play into ethics. I think the way morality came about in its pre-morality state was completely emotivist. It was all responses to likes and dislikes. It was completely subjective at that time. So yes, emotions do play into our ethics completely. They also can play into people's personal standards as well. Think about how many people feel offended and that's my right. Because you've offended me, I'm in the right, you're in the wrong. But people can be offended by all sorts of shit. Shit that isn't even offensive. I mean, shit, we could say boy bands. I find boy bands offensive. Therefore, no boy bands are allowed to play. Well, actually, other people enjoy them. So what I could do is I could complain about boy bands, or I could go, well, it's just not for me. But you know what? You lot enjoy them. Let's carry on. You know, you're not hurting anyone by enjoying that thing. And there are a lot of things that people get offended about that don't actually hurt anyone. It's just the way they've been brought up. I mean, a lot of it's habitual as well. You consider something like swear words, right? At the end of the day, these words are just words. If they were truly as bad as people said, then a euphemism for the word would be equally as offensive, or the actual definition behind the word. So think of the word shit. Sugar, right? That's what some people say instead of shit when they mean shit. That's what my mum always used to say. The most she would swear with, and she wouldn't swear shit, was bum. That was her. Oh, bum. But she would say sugar instead of shit. But the intention is the same. So if the intent behind the word was what made it offensive, then she's got the same intent. But if it's what the word means rather than the intent, then what the word means is poo. So saying poo or fecal matter or anything like that would equally be offensive. The fact of the matter is, people have learnt to be offended by the words by being told off for saying the words when they're younger, and it's been ingrained in them so much that when they get older and they hear people freely saying these words, they're like, you can't say that thing. So to bring it back into your question about how it affects the ethics, I mean, that's just one thing. That's offence. It's things that aren't actually causing any harm, but people are playing it into their own personal standard. You're wrong because I feel offended. And it's the same way that, if someone feels hurt or anything by that, they will think along those lines. They might not consciously be aware of that. They might not even be thinking. I mean, if they think, I feel offended, therefore you're wrong, they obviously haven't thought much into the topic. Well, why is it wrong? What have they actually done? And I think that comes down to what we were talking about just a second ago with the reaction bit, to the emotion. They felt offended and they attacked. That would be an irrational response. If they had felt offended, sat back and considered it, why do I feel like this? Are they actually hurting anyone? No, I just don't like it, so I'm going to avoid that person because this is a behaviour they demonstrate, but actually it's not really wrong, I just don't like it myself. And there would be the rational response to it. I actually tied that one back into rationality of emotion, Dave.
Nice one.
Oh, victory sip. So yeah, I think at least my position on it, emotions are not rational in and of themselves. They're not necessarily irrational. It's the action that comes after it and how you reason. If you act purely on the emotion, I think it's back to like saying, well, my mate said this, so I believed him. Well, I felt this way, so I acted this way. I think that's irrational. I think if you think about it, why am I feeling this way? What's happened? Is it right to feel this way? Should I do X, Y, Z? And think about your response. Then you have a better a way of looking into it.
Yeah. Well, that would be one way of rejecting the paradox. That would to
Dave, we lost you there. Sorry, mate.
That's all right. Am I back now?
Yeah, you're back.
Sorry about that. Stream's going a bit wonky tonight.
Because we've got a new viewer.
It's straining the system. So yeah, that would be similar to something like Kathleen Stock. She rejects premise B that in their rational forms, emotions like fear, sorrow, and joy involve beliefs that they're about things that are real and unreal. So it's rational to respond. It's similar to what LB said earlier about irrational emotional response is one that's at the right time for the right reason. So she would just consider responses to fictional scenarios as a rational response because they're designed to make you feel that way.
Yeah. Yeah, it comes down to the action bit after the emotion. I would have to agree with her there that.
Well, that is part of the rational response, isn't it? You holding back and engaging, but still realizing that it's not real.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. Well, I agree with her. What was her name again? I need to look her up.
Kathleen Stock.
Kathleen Stork. It's not come up on any of my searches. What's her main sort of thing that she does, or is it mainly aesthetics?
It was mainly aesthetics. She's currently a hot topic in philosophy because she's doing philosophy of gender.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Very sensitive subject at the moment, I imagine.
Yeah.
Is
Do you
she
remember
taking Is she taking
Well,
the wrong side?
yeah, basically.
Oh,
There's a lot of people on that side in philosophy. There's lots like Stephen Law's response, and then, there's lots on the wrong side and the right side. It all depends.
yeah. I mean, I know people have misinterpreted Stephen Law's argument on that. He was trying to be open and just explain, if you look at it this way, or if you look at it this way, you look at it this way. But I still felt at the end of the article, it came through that he had that separation of sex and gender and all that sort of stuff, even though he was trying to be as open with it. But I think because he was not completely concise with what he was saying and hating on the people who think sex and gender are the same sort of thing, it was interpreted that, well, you haven't said this thing, therefore you're in that bit. Tribalism again, stuff that we fall victim to all the time ourselves, because we haven't said something Aaron Ra said. We disagree with Aaron Ra, therefore we're theists. Okay, then.
Yeah. Yeah, it is that kind of response, the sort of atheists. You can't be a real atheist because you don't hate religion kind of thing. Or because you give them some leeway, that type of stuff.
Yeah. But yeah, it's interesting that she'd take that sort of approach with it. So yeah, I mean, maybe that's something we need to cover off in a future stream as well.
I'm not going near that with somebody else's arms.
Yeah, okay, well, fair enough. I think it would be quite a good one to have, but I can imagine there'd be a lot of heated discussion around that sort of thing.
Yeah, we get support for all the wrong reasons, and that's why I wouldn't want to touch it.
Fair enough. Okay, so question from LB. How do we avoid making emotions into our ethics? It would make sense for an objection for objective morality. And you can see why people favour subjective morality instead. Yeah. I do think that there is an emotive part to morality. I think, as I said, it's where it started. But I think that if you're talking about subjective morality in the terms of moral subjectivism, I think it's quite easy to put that one to rest, because